Want to see something weird? I was walking through my friendly local gaming store, and I always like to check out their used miniatures section just to see what they've got. And I found these two little uglies. Greater Blight drones of Nurgle. I believe these guys are from 2012 when Forge World was doing their Siege of Rax campaign, where they were coming out with a lot of Chaos and Deathcore Krieg stuff. But these guys are glorious. I want to take a moment to appreciate the previous owner's paint job. It's pretty good, and it's also not very thick. I don't think I'll have any trouble painting on top of it. Although they did use Nurgle's Rot, which is a technical paint for adding thick snot. I wish I could get this off, but the gift of Nurgle is the gift that keeps on giving. I am really excited to have these guys for my army because in my opinion, this is what a Death Guard vehicle should look like. Really, really simple and really, really gross. The Fetid Bloat drone and the Blight hauler, they're very nice models, but they're really, really busy. It feels like they're trying really hard to be cool. Where these guys, twin rotors attached to a shrimp body wearing crab-like armor, it just kind of works, even if it is absolutely absurd. And I think that absurdity is what makes them so chaotic. I want to get these guys up and running and added to my collection where they're going to be doing double duty. And the key word is duty. I had just a little bit of cleanup. A few resin gates slipped by the previous owner, and there is a seam line running across the forehead of these floating tanks, and I want to knock that down with some sanding and plastic putty. I love the texture that these guys have, this sort of hammered finish. I'm pretty sure what that is green stuff with a million pokes with the back of a paintbrush, and I really hope I can incorporate that onto my other Death Guard vehicles. With that said though, I might be about to ruin it. A motif of Nurgle is tree-like growths coming out of stuff, so I went to my bits bin and found some epic basing trees. I clipped off a few choice branches and then picked a few spots on their heads to drill into. I made little holes a little bit bigger than I needed because I want it to look like the tree has burst out from under their armor. I rolled a little snake of milliput and superglued it to the edge of my hole. Then I squished it down, cutting away the excess, and then came back in with the back of my paintbrush and mushed it into the soft putty again and again, replicating the armor texture. It worked really well and gave me a nasty looking hole. I inserted my tree into the hole and it works really, really well and looks really, really gross. Like some kind of gross bug. I made up a few more holes and filled them with more horn-like trees. I guess you could say these guys are horny. Look at my little shrimpies! Tryptophobics look away. The trees are sprouting. Now I got these guys all modeled up. It is now time for the bases. And the bases are kind of my favorite part of these guys. Back in the old days when there was a Forge World website, there was a picture of these guys, and they didn't use the old Games Workshop flying stand. They did a custom job that was brilliant. They had a stream of goo coming out of these guys' ends, and that was what was holding them aloft, and it was genius. Just the brown goo splattering all over the ground. It just added so much dynamicness to the miniatures and made them even that much more disgusting. That is what I want to replicate with my little plague drones. These little chaos shrimps stand on 60mm bases, or rather fly over 60mm bases. And it's a little tricky that they fly because I have to figure out what to fill up the bases with. Because I don't have to worry about where feet are gonna go, I can make the landscaping on the bases more dramatic. I superglued down big chunks of cork and then smoothed them out with milliput, making a little valley in the middle of each base, then covering them in texture paste. Now it's time for the slime. For this, I'm gonna start with clear transparent rods. To hold them, I put one end in my pin vise so I don't burn my fingers when I heat them up with the heat gun. I've used lighter to do this in the past, but it's a little tricky to not singe and discolor the plastic. Once I had a nice wavy shape, I cut it in half. The clear transparent rod is going right up their rears, so I drilled a hole and inserted the rod with a little super glue, and then I drilled a hole in the base going all the way down to the plastic. They are still pretty springy, but I'm hoping that this gets fixed later when I come back and turn these clear stems into streams of dirty, messy poo. Now that I know where my boys are gonna float on the base, I have plenty of room left for decorations. My Death Guard are flying over a battlefield, spreading the rot, so I found some bits like this barrel and Nurgle bell. I carved up my barrel and jerry can and sunk them into the wet clay, adding some battle damage with my pin vise and adding some more texture paste on top to make them look rusty. And I slobbered more of my brown earth paste around the bottom, so it looks like they're sinking into the muck. Now that my little drone is permanently attached, I broke out some hot water to reposition their rotors. I dipped them into the hot water to soften them up, and then I bent their wings to make them perpendicular with the ground for maximum lift. These guys could either be the Fetid Bloat drone or the Greater Blight drones of Nurgle. Fetid Bloat drone is essentially a rhino with like a bad las cannon and a pretty good heavy flamer. The Greater Blight drone has a slightly better gun. I mean, a slightly better bad gun. Toughness 8 is kind of a rough spot to be in. Not good against vehicles, but pretty darn good against tough infantry. The real juice of these guys, and the reason that they somehow cost 60 points more, is Deep Strike. And Deep Strike is an incredibly powerful ability. And the Death Guard are a very honest army. We don't have infiltrators or deep strikers, we just march towards our opponents. But with these guys, you kinda don't need to. They can drop out of the sky, and that is incredibly important for secondaries like area denial or secure corners. But is that worth a whole bunch of points? Death Guard players, let me know. Greater Blight drone or Fetid Bloat drone? I need to know. But I guess it's not that big a deal because it's essentially the same model standing on the same base, so I can just try it both ways. But before I give it a try, I have to get them painted. I need to protect my clear rod, so I took out my liquid mask and gave each one 2 coats of the stuff. Now I can prime. I sprayed them both black and then gave them a zenithal of white paint. And they look really good with just this. My Death Guard always start out really clean before they get nice and dirty. I set up my palette with my 8 colors: black, piggy pink, gray, white, green, blue, yellow, and rusty brown. Now, these 8 paints are the only thing I use for my Death Guard, but I did have some foresight. When the company was closing up shop, I reached out and I got a second set of these colors, so I'm pretty sure I have more than enough paint to get my Death Guard done. But it's gonna be a really fun experiment because I'm only using these colors. Just how far do normal 17 milliliter paint bottles get ya? Once these guys are empty, I'm gonna be able to line up all of my Death Guard and see just how far does paint go. I wanna make their crab armor blue and their flesh pink. I started by thinning down my blue and green paint a lot and running this all over their armor, being random with what parts are blue and what parts are green. Thinning the paint helps me take advantage of my zenithal, keeping the lighter spots brighter and more desaturated and going over the darker areas again and again until my colors were fully saturated. Once I was happy with my colors, I started working on the texture. The model already has a ton of texture, but I want more. I made a million little white dots over the armor, making it dense right on their foreheads, then less dots moving down the sides. Then I mixed some yellow into my green and glazed this over top. I want the edges of my panels to look darker, so I mixed my black into the blue to create a dark wash and I ran this all around the edges. Then I did the same thing in reverse, mixing white into my blue and glazing this over the highlights. The top of each armor segment is looking good, but it still needs a little something. I am digging the armor on these guys. It has a very nautical feel to it, but these are the biggest Death Guard models I have painted so far. I think for the first time for my Death Guard, I need to break out the airbrush. I've never airbrushed these colors before, but these guys needed a little something. I sprayed a mix of white and green on the top of each armor panel to get a nice bright spot. The airbrush does a better job of making these smooth transitions than I can do myself with a brush. And speaking of things the airbrush does better than me, I added more white paint into my airbrush and turned the PSI all the way down until the paint was just spitting out. And I sprayed this over my model, making hundreds of little dots to keep the texture going. Now I can go back in with my paintbrush, using very watery yellow to add a sickly tinge to the blue and green armor. These guys don't get many baths. Best they can hope for is flying in the rain. After that, I want to fill in all the cracks with rust. I thinned down my red-brown color and loaded up my paintbrush, touching it down to the model so that it flows right into the cracks. Both these guys are identical, so I try to pick different cracks on each one to rust up so that they don't look so samey. My little trees also help make them not so identical. I painted the branches with the yellow paint, doing some quick wet blending, putting brown on the bottom and white on top, and then using a clean brush to smear these colors together. Now it's time for all their flesh. I think Chaos is the only faction that has vehicles made of meat. I glazed pink over their shrimp bodies and tails and then thinned down a mixture of green and black paint. This acted like a wash, making their bodies even grosser. Now my base coats are done, it's time for some highlights, going back with my pink paint and then adding more highlights, mixing white into the paint until I was working with pure white. Now the skin is done, but it's too uniform, and it's too clean. I made a mix of my rust color, green and black, into a dark brown, and I glazed this like a shadow, under his body and around his more deep crevices. Then I glazed my rust color over the straps that are holding his armor on, which is also a fun detail that he is not naturally armored, so the Death Guard found big worms, domesticated them, and then made armor and helicopter rotors for them. Now that his flesh is done, I moved on to the weapons. Base coating these with gray. I like to use gray for weapons across my Death Guard army to make them stand out. Usually to make something stand out, you paint it a bright saturated color, but in my army, normal dull colors are the ones that stand out. I washed it with black wash, and once that was dry, I broke out a little piece of sponge and sponged on white paint, which is highlighting the edges of the weapons and gave them some great texture. I glazed a little bit of green paint over the back of the guns and a little blue in the front to bring a little of my Death Guard colors into the guns, and then they were finished. Now for those eyes. I base coated some dark pink around the eyes, and I had a thought. I think these are meant to be mechanical lenses, but what if they were real living eyes? I base coated them with my red-brown, mixing in some white paint and then hitting these areas again, then again with a little more white to make them look inflamed. I took my sharpest paintbrush and did some little veins running from the cracks and then dotted them with blue. Then a little dot of white to make them look shiny and reflective. I think these are much creepier than lenses. After that, I painted the rim yellow, and then it was time for the rotors. I mixed red into my yellow to get a mustard color and base coated the wings, and I made a brown for the bottom set of propellers. Then I took pure yellow paint and my smallest dry brush and wiped it over the rotors so that it would leave behind streaks. I did this again, mixing white into my yellow, and it helps sell the spinning. I washed the bottom rotors with black wash and let this spill onto the middle. Then I used green paint to make it look like the middle of the rotors is where dirt and grime really builds up. Then I hit them again with some white paint in my dry brush to bring back those spinny scratches, and I used blue to shade the underside of each rotor. Oh, my little rotten shrimpies are so great, and I really want to work on that emergency bathroom disembarkation. Really looking forward to it. I'm going to be using some UV cure resin and some other fun tools to make that particular Taco Bell Tuesday night kind of look, but for right now, I got to get the bases done. I mixed my red and black together into a brown and glazed this over the base. The model is so bright and saturated, I want the base to be dull and boring to make the model stand out more. I painted the decorations with a coat of green paint, thinning it down so my zenithal shows through, and while everything was still wet, I added some blue paint, feathering it into the brown. Then I mixed my yellow into white to get a tan paint and dry brushed this over the base to highlight all the lovely textures the paste and cork give me. And my boys are officially finished, but not done. Usually I varnish at the end, but I don't want to varnish the poop, so I need to do that first before I take off the masking fluid. I gave the drone a coat of satin varnish to keep the colors nice and vibrant, and the base a coat of matte varnish. These two different finishes on the model will help separate them and make them look more interesting. And you know what's very interesting? That's right, our Patreon. This month we have the Mining Colony Terrain and Vehicles, utilitarian machines that are more than they appear, designed to ride across the landscape firing stolen weapons or tunneling underneath to lay traps. And the mine and containers make for thematic and useful terrain. The colony is ready to uprise. And if you always want to be up to date on what's happening at Eons of Battle and be entered into our monthly giveaways, this month we're picking 3 followers to win this month's terrain. Follow the link in the description to sign up to our newsletter. My boys are done! Oh, and I'm so excited because you know what time it is. It's time to go number 2. I peeled away the liquid mask and got to work, pouring UV resin over the clear rod. I moved it around with a toothpick, and when I had it nice and gloopy, I hit it with the UV lamp to lock it down. I did this a couple of times to get it just right. Now that I have my stream, I need to make a splash. I took a plastic blister pack and started cutting it up into tiny little triangles. I poured on more texture paste around the base of the stream and poked these spikes into the goo. This was a little tricky. On the second splash, I did them one by one, that was much easier. Once I had them on there, I hit them with the UV light to lock them in place, and then I bent the triangles down into arcs. The goo is falling pretty far, so there's gonna be some serious splash. These drones are flying, so they would be leaving behind a trail of goo, and to represent this, I poured a line of UV resin behind the splash, and I added more plastic so that there's a sheet of water, like the previous splashes are receding. I took a toothpick loaded up with more UV resin and held the base upside down. Then I dripped some UV to the tips of each triangle, and gravity helped to make them into perfect little droplets. And I finished it off with UV light, giving it about 5 minutes to fully cure. It looks great, a perfect little splash of some crystal clean water. Now it's time to make it dirty. I broke out my Badger Ghost Tint paints. These are very transparent paints, and I never really use them because they dry incredibly glossy, but for this, it'll be perfect. I poured out some yellow, green, and brown and put these over the goo, and instantly it changed from glass-like crystal to an unsightly brown stream coming out of their little rears. The melee weapon of the Plague Drone is the Plague Probe. Do with that information what you will. The Greater Blight Drone of Nurgle is an objectively good model. And you know how I know that it's a good model? Because Google Greater Blight Drone of Nurgle. Every single result is a banger. Any paint job on this guy just looks good because of the simplicity, just how characterful it is. These guys work. Oh, and I'm really excited to have them in my army because my Death Guard army is odd. I've got the original Nurgle Demon Prince, I got the Greater Blight Drones, like it's a very eclectic army. Let me know in the comments below what Death Guard thing I should work on next. Probably Morty, but I don't really like the Plague Burst Crawler, and so I have some fun ideas for kit bashes to those guys. Thanks for watching.